I can't breathe oxygen, but I still want to kiss you. There is no training manual that adequately prepares you for the moment you find a glowing alien girl, frozen inside a drifting asteroid coffin, with a face like it's asking for help, and a body that definitely should not be alive anymore. I know, because I checked every page of the official Interstellar Scout Corps handbook, while I was trying not to freak out about the implications of what I'd just towed into my ship. I had been on a routine pass through a debris field near the edge of the Eridani Drift, checking for salvage or signs of unauthorized mining, when my scanners pinged something weird. Not dangerous weird, but weird enough to make me pause my audiobook and actually pay attention, which tells you just how unusual it was. The signal came from inside an ice-wrapped fragment of some ancient wreckage, tumbling in a slow spiral through nothing. I approached cautiously, because caution is how I've managed to stay alive in a job with a surprisingly high number of spontaneous combustion incidents. What I found was an escape pod that looked like it had lost a fight with a star and then gotten flash frozen in the aftermath. It had markings I didn't recognize, which was saying something because I've seen everything from Braca blood sigils to corporate logos written in dead languages. Inside the pod was a girl. At least, I assumed she was a girl based on the general humanoid shape and the long hair that floated around her face like silver seaweed. Her skin was a light purple color that pulsed faintly with internal bioluminescence. She was curled in the fetal position, eyes closed, breathing shallowly if at all, and her vitals were registering as both alive and not compatible with human life, which was a fun little contradiction for my brain to process. I stared at her for a solid 30 seconds trying to figure out if this was a trap, a hallucination, or a first contact scenario with the potential to either make my career or get me vaporized. Then she opened her eyes and looked directly at me. You know that feeling when you lock eyes with something across a great distance and feel like it just peeled open your thoughts and had a look around? Yeah, it was that. Her eyes were enormous and pale like swirling galaxies compressed into spheres, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Not because she was beautiful, though she definitely was in an otherworldly way, but because there was something terrifyingly familiar in her gaze, like she already knew me. Like I had just walked into the middle of someone else's story and hadn't been given a script. I tapped the comms and reported an unidentified life form, which command responded to with their usual blend of indifference and protocol speak, suggesting I mark the pod for collection and move on. Instead, I did something deeply stupid and entirely human. I brought her aboard. I activated the containment field in my medbay, adjusted the atmosphere to something close to what my sensors guessed her species might tolerate, and opened the pod. There was a hiss, a crackle, and then a very quiet moan that might have been pain or disorientation or both. She tried to sit up and immediately clutched her throat, her body convulsing slightly like she was drowning on air, which is not a sentence I ever thought I'd have to use but accurately describes what happened next. I slammed the emergency seal and pumped in a custom gas mix, praying I wasn't about to melt her internal organs. Thankfully, her body stopped convulsing and she slumped back into the cushioned wall, breathing again in short, panic bursts. Her gaze darted around the room until it found me again, and this time she didn't look surprised. She looked relieved. I took a cautious step forward and raised both hands in the universal gesture of please do not kill me. She blinked slowly, then reached out with trembling fingers toward the transparent barrier between us. Her fingertips glowed as they touched the surface, and a faint ripple of color spread from her hand like heat distortion. I mirrored the gesture without thinking, PR. The first time I tried to explain the concept of a sandwich to an alien who could not breathe oxygen, I realized I might be in over my head. Not because she didn't understand what a sandwich was, at least not entirely, but because halfway through my enthusiastic explanation of condiments she tapped the glass barrier with a look that said please stop before I lose respect for you completely. To be fair, Ale probably had more pressing concerns than learning about mustard. Like the fact that her lungs would collapse instantly in my ship's atmosphere if the containment field blinked out for even a second. But I had to fill the silence with something and sandwiches were what my brain offered under pressure. To her credit, she humored me. She sat cross-legged inside the glowing dome of her atmosphere field, watching with that calm alien intensity that made me feel like I was being scanned at a molecular level for signs of idiocy. Her skin pulsed with bioluminescent rhythms that I was slowly learning to interpret as emotional states. Blue-white meant curiosity. Pale violet meant peace. And when it flickered orange-red, that usually meant confusion or possibly discomfort, which I found out the hard way after offering her a hologram of a dog as a welcome gift. Apparently large barking carnivores do not exist in her culture, and she thought I had declared war. So we were making progress. Limited, nonverbal, occasionally awkward progress. I spent most of the next day retrofitting a second containment field on the opposite side of the room so I could sit in close proximity without asphyxiating her or vice versa. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. We were like two exhibits at a zoo watching each other through plexiglass, hoping the other wasn't dangerous or contagious. She mimicked my posture sometimes. If I leaned back in my chair, she'd lean back against the curved wall of her habitat. If I scratched my head, she'd raise her fingers to her temple and sort of tap it like she was trying to understand what the gesture meant. And when I smiled, she tilted her head and blinked slowly, which I took as her version of a polite "What the hell are you doing with your mouth?" Eventually she started drawing. At first it was just shapes on the condensation inside her field. Swirls and dots and lines that resembled constellations or maybe just abstract scribbles. But then she drew two stick figures. One was clearly me. The other was clearly her. I say this because mine had a large head with a comically rectangular jaw, and her figure glowed faintly as she touched the lines. In the drawing, our stick arms reached out and met in the middle. Then she pointed to it and looked at me with that now familiar expression that suggested I should be smarter than I am. I raised my eyebrows and pointed at myself, then at her, then at the drawing, and nodded. She smiled. Not the soft, almost smile from before, but a real one. It lit up her face like someone had switched on a star inside her skull. Her skin shimmered gold for a moment, and I felt something weird in my chest, like my heart had leaned forward without consulting me first. That night I had dreams I couldn't explain. Nothing overtly strange, but filled with images I had never seen and sounds I had never heard. Voices whispering in a language that didn't exist but still felt like it should, and light moving through darkness in familiar patterns that made no logical sense. I woke up sweaty and confused and slightly embarrassed to realize I had whispered her name in my sleep. I told myself it was just stress or isolation or some kind of side effect from breathing recycled air too long, but deep down I knew better. The connection was real. Whatever had happened when we first touched the barrier wasn't just static discharge. It had left something inside me humming faintly like background radiation in my thoughts. I wanted to understand her. Not just communicate with her, but actually understand her. Who she was, where she came from, what she had lost, and what she saw when she looked at me. So I started building a shared symbol. I am reasonably certain that Alec called me a smelly monkey. Not in so many words, of course. Words are still not her thing unless they are made of shimmering glyphs or weird humming noises that sound like a harp being stepped on. But communication is about intent, and the intent was very clear when she squinted at me, tapped her nose in what I assume was the universal alien gesture for stink, and then drew a stick figure of me with exaggerated hair and what looked suspiciously like bananas falling out of my pocket. I don't carry bananas. I don't even like bananas. I once got food poisoning from a banana-flavored protein bar and have never forgiven the entire fruit family since. But there it was, a crudely glowing sketch of Nathan the fruit ape, drawn by a glowing girl in an oxygen-free bubble who had just the night before expressed an interspecies longing to kiss me. I did not know how to feel about that. Actually I did, but I was trying very hard not to let my feelings get ahead of my ability to process the situation. Feelings, as it turned out, were kind of a problem. When Alette touched the barrier now, it wasn't just curiosity or friendly alien vibes. There was something new in the pulses of light from her fingers. Something deliberate. A pattern that repeated. I had seen it once before, accidentally, when I had accessed her ship's interface through a hacked relay. That same rhythm, the soft pulsing white-blue-red, had shown up next to a symbol that roughly translated to pairing. It was the cultural equivalent of setting your relationship status to its complicated on an alien dating profile. And I was pretty sure she was doing it on purpose now. This wasn't just a curiosity anymore. This was her way of saying we had moved into a different category. And my response so far had been to give her sandwiches and educational videos about penguins, which, in hindsight, might have sent the wrong message. I tried to clarify. I pulled up the shared display and typed out a sentence using the agreed-upon symbols. I am confused. Are you mocking me or attempting courtship? She blinked, and her skin flickered with that golden glow I was learning to associate with humor. Then she drew a banana, circled it, and tapped the stick figure of me twice. I sighed. Smelly monkey it is. After that, things got weird, or weirder if I'm being honest. We began spending more time interacting directly through the barrier, which had started to feel less like a safety measure and more like a cruel cosmic joke. Every time our fingers touched, I felt those little sparks of memory and emotion. They were getting stronger too. Clearer. At one point I saw a flash of her childhood, or at least what I assumed was her childhood, floating in a pod surrounded by other small glowing figures, laughing in a way I could feel but not hear. It felt intimate. Too intimate. Like I had stumbled into a diary I wasn't supposed to read but couldn't stop flipping through. And it was mutual. I could tell because one night she recoiled slightly and gave me a look that I could only describe as "oh you poor sad creature" after a brief contact where I had apparently broadcasted a memory of my worst high school dance. I didn't even remember thinking about it. It had just leaked out. The wrong shoes, the awkward slow dance, the girl who asked if I was okay halfway through and then never spoke to me again. Alette touched the barrier gently afterward, an apology maybe, or a form of comfort. Her skin glowed soft pink and white. I got the message. She didn't think less of me for being an emotional wreck in formal wear. And that might have been the moment I started falling for her, which was not something I had penciled into my mission itinerary. Falling for someone who cannot survive the same air you breathe is a logistical nightmare. Add in the species barrier, the lack of shared language, and the fact that my ship only has one bathroom and you start to understand the level of absurdity I was operating under. But there was something about her. Not just the way she looked, though yes, she. It started with her hand. I mean that quite literally. One minute I was recalibrating the secondary oxygen recycler because apparently even futuristic ships like mine still struggle with humidity control when you sweat your way through 3 hours of containment field diagnostics, and the next minute Alette pressed her palm against the barrier and looked at me in a way that made me feel like maybe I was the science experiment and she was the one with the clipboard. This wasn't new exactly. We'd done the whole palm-to-palm thing before. It was our default emotional handshake. But this time she didn't stop at the hand. Her fingers spread slowly. Her gaze was steady. Then she tilted her head just slightly and traced the outline of my palm with the tip of hers along the glass. And let me tell you something. Nothing has ever short-circuited my brain faster than being pseudo-caressed through a pressure-sealed composite wall by a glowing alien girl whose last message to me was an emotional projection containing the word union. I stared like an idiot. To her credit, she didn't laugh. Or maybe she did and it just didn't translate. Either way, she followed it up by drawing a sequence of symbols in quick succession on her side of the interface. I recognized a few. Trust. Safe. Seek. Then one I had to dig into the glossary to decode. It translated roughly as deeper knowing. Which was poetic and a little terrifying, and also exactly the kind of phrase you never want to misinterpret when bodily contact could involve psychic residue. I sat down and tapped the console to start a log. Then changed my mind and deleted it. This wasn't for the record. This was personal. I took a deep breath and replied using our shared symbols. Are you asking to initiate contact protocol? She nodded slowly. The lights under her skin rippled in a slow concentric wave. I tapped back. I am open to contact. But need clarity. What does it mean? Her reply was slower this time. Not because she didn't know but because she was thinking very carefully. When the symbols appeared they came in pairs. You feel. I feel. You know. I show. Our minds. One field. Then finally. Touch not pain. Touch memory. Touch choice. I sat there for a long time staring at those symbols. She wanted to show me something. Something that couldn't be expressed through light or symbol or mimicry. Something that needed to be transmitted directly. I checked the containment logs. She couldn't survive even 2 seconds in my atmosphere. I couldn't last more than 3 in hers. We were two halves of a conversation that could never meet in the middle. Unless I built a bridge. That bridge came in the form of a suit. Not a standard one. This was a prototype I had salvaged months ago from an abandoned outpost. A xeno-adaptive bittersweet designed for cross-environment interaction. I had dismissed it as impractical at the time because who actually needs a suit that lets you walk through sulfuric vapor while hugging radioactive jellyfish? Apparently I did. It took me 5 hours to recalibrate it to her exact atmospheric parameters. Another 2 to reinforce the filtration layers so I wouldn't die horribly from an enzyme overload. And the entire time I kept glancing over at her while she waited patiently tracing little patterns into the glass like she was doodling to keep calm before a date. When the suit was ready I climbed in. It sealed with a soft hiss and the onboard AI chirped to life announcing that compatibility was at 71%, which was close enough for me. I activated the airlock between our compartments and stepped through. The shift was immediate. Her atmosphere was heavier than mine, more humid with a faintly electric taste like the air before a thunderstorm. My HUD flickered but held. Alas stood motionless as I approached. Her eyes wide not with fear but anticipation. I stopped a meter away and raised my hand slowly. She mirrored me. Then I took one step forward and our hands met. Not through glass. Not through sensors. Real contact. Skin to suit. Her fingers pulsed warm against the synthetic law. There is something profoundly inconvenient about falling for someone whose very breath could kill you, not metaphorically kill you in the tragic romantic sense where it's so beautiful it hurts, but literally, chemically, biologically kill you with one unfortunate lungful of their native atmosphere. And the worst part is I knew it and I still couldn't stop thinking about her. I mean really thinking, not just the usual lonely pilot fantasies where your brain grabs the nearest pretty face and throws it into a mental rom-com for 2 hours of dopamine. No, this was different. This was the kind of thinking where you accidentally whisper their name out loud in your sleep and then have to pretend you were dreaming about a food replicator malfunction just to preserve a shred of dignity, and the ship didn't buy it. Not that the ship was sentient or anything, but I swear the air circulation hissed in judgment every time I passed her containment field, which, by the way, was now the most carefully maintained subsystem in the entire vessel. I checked it 6 times a day, ran redundancies, upgraded the backup power supply, and even added a fail-safe emergency seal in case of pressure failure. And I don't do that kind of maintenance for myself. Hell, I once went 6 weeks without recalibrating the cockpit inertial dampeners because the manual said maybe it wasn't necessary depending on mass variance, and honestly, who checks their own mass variance mid-transit? But now everything was different because Aled was here, glowing softly in her golden blue bubble of air and memory, and she had touched my chest with her bare hand and it hadn't burned through the suit, but it had burned through something inside me, something I thought had been permanently fireproofed after that incident on Ceres Station with the engineer who said she loved my eyes and then stole my entire data cache and left me drunk in a broken hapod with 2 credits and a broken nose, and yet here I was again. This time with an alien girl who couldn't eat my food or speak my language or survive on my ship without a fully customized biomechanical buffer zone, and I was already in too deep to turn back. Not that I wanted to turn back, because the dreams were getting stronger, more vivid, more real. I would wake up and swear I could smell her air, taste the particles, feel her fingers trace my thoughts even though I was physically sealed away in my bunk and hadn't left my room in 8 hours, and every time I walked back into the med bay she would be there, waiting, her eyes catching the light like 2 soft galaxies unfolding, and she would draw something new, a memory, a joke, a feeling. Once she even drew a caricature of me with what I swear were exaggerated biceps and tiny legs and then dissolved into shimmering laughter when I rolled my eyes at her. And that laugh, oh hell, that laugh was the worst part, because it was light, pure light, not sound, not a vibration in the air but a ripple. in the atmosphere of her field that danced along her skin and made everything inside me feel like it was trying to rewire itself to harmonize with her joy, and I realized I was falling, not metaphorically again, I was slipping, gradually, hopelessly, beautifully into whatever existed in the gap between species and sense, and the worst part was that I think she knew, in fact I was certain she knew, because the last time we touched through the barrier her light had gone pink, a shade I hadn't catalogued yet. And when I asked what it meant she wrote 3 symbols on the panel and all 3 translated to forms of affection, the kind of affection that translated loosely to I see your faults and still choose you, and I just stood there like an idiot breathing too fast and trying to figure out what the hell a human man was supposed to do when a bioluminescent alien with lethal lungs tells you she's emotionally invested, and while I was spiraling the COMM system chirped and I almost dropped the data slate, because nothing ruins a moment like the real world. And this time the real world was a mid-tier res. There are many things that can be said about going on a date inside a full-body hazmat suit, and very few of them are flattering, but when the girl you're trying to impress literally breathes air that could melt your lungs like butter in a microwave, your options for romance become severely limited, and you have to get creative. And by creative, I mean desperate enough to engineer a temporary low-pressure cross-species interface chamber out of spare maintenance tubing, an old EVA harness, and a second-hand Xeno Seal helmet I found buried under a pile of expired rations in cargo hold B. Before you ask, yes, I did test it first, no, I did not follow proper calibration procedures, and yes, it nearly caused a pressure inversion the first time I turned it on. But that's what love does to you. It makes you stupid and brave in equal measure, and I've always had more bravery than brains, which is probably why I ended up alone on a science vessel with exactly 0 dating prospects until one glowing alien girl crash-landed into my life and refused to leave my thoughts for even a single rational second. So now here I was, inside what I generously called a hybrid interface pod, standing 2 feet away from Ella, who was watching me like I had just offered to juggle antimatter for her amusement. I could hardly blame her. I probably looked ridiculous. The suit made me look like a silver marshmallow with limbs, and the air was so humid my visor kept fogging up from the inside, no matter how many times I rerouted the breath vents. But I didn't care, because this was our first time in the same space, no barriers, no filters, just 2 species daring physics and reason to step aside for 5 minutes while we figured out if touching was worth dying for. And I have to say, the answer leaned heavily toward yes, at least in that moment. Because when she stepped forward and placed her hand against my chest, the suit's sensors spiked and I felt the vibrations ripple through the inner lining and into my skin like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me, and I knew this was real. More real than any conversation I'd had in years, and probably more honest than most of them too. Then she looked up at me and blinked slowly, her fingers glowing with that soft golden light that meant affection or reassurance or maybe just that she was glad I hadn't exploded yet. I tried to speak, but my mouth forgot how language worked, so I just nodded like a very emotionally overwhelmed bobblehead, and she smiled, and I swear to every star in the sky that I could have passed out right then and died happy. She must have sensed it, because she reached up and placed her palm gently against the side of my helmet, and even though there was at least 4 inches of glass and composite alloy between us, it still felt like she was touching my skin. That thought terrified me, not because I was afraid of her, but because I wasn't afraid at all, and that kind of vulnerability hits hard when you're the kind of person who usually handles intimacy by offering people snacks and avoiding eye contact. Then she spoke, not in words, not out loud, but through a resonance that moved through her fingers and into my suit's sensory matrix and directly into my bones, and I felt her say welcome. Not like a greeting, but like a place, a space that existed between us now, and I realized that this room, this pod, this suit, had become more than technology. It had become trust, and for someone like her, whose last connection had been lost to the void, that meant something powerful. I knew I had to respond, so I reached out slowly, held out my hand, and she took it without hesitation. The suit flexed and adjusted, and my fingers found the soft, pliable outline of hers through the membrane, and we stood like that for several seconds, breathing separately together in silence so thick it felt holy. Then I decided to do something even stupider than the rest of my decisions so far. I asked her to dance. Yes, I know that sounds absurd. I know that asking a being from another planet, who glows when she's happy and the thing about kisses, as I've come to realize, is that they are wildly overrated when you try to explain them to someone who has never heard of the concept and whose species expresses affection using skin conductivity patterns, emotion pulse resonance, and something called molecular mirroring, which I still don't fully understand but seems to involve sharing a subconscious feedback loop through prolonged physical contact, which sounds terrifying if you've ever had a really bad day and don't want someone glowing it back at you, but also sort of beautiful when you think about it as the ultimate version of I feel you. And yet, despite all that, I still found myself standing inside the hybrid interaction pod with Aleph for the third time that week, wearing my highly temperamental suit and mentally trying to translate one of the most intimate human experiences into a gesture that wouldn't accidentally trigger a biological panic response, because nothing says romantic failure quite like being medically evacuated from your own ship due to spontaneous neurological combustion caused by an alien kiss attempt gone wrong. And to be completely clear, she was the one who brought it up, not me. I didn't just walk in and suggest we smooch as a cross-cultural experiment. She had drawn a new series of symbols on the shared panel, and the translation system, which had recently been upgraded with contextual language prediction based on emotional feedback patterns, gave me the following message: I want to try the joining. Not the deep link, just the surface one, the one with intention and shared presence and anchored breath. And I stared at that sentence for 5 full minutes before realizing it was her version of asking for a kiss, or at least something functionally similar to one. And my first thought was oh no, because I had no idea what that entailed. And my second thought was oh yes, because despite not knowing, I very much wanted to find out. And then my third thought was dear God, please let this not kill me. And if you think that's an exaggeration, you've clearly never had to run a full biohazard protocol for your own face before a date, which is what I did, spending 3 hours in prep, sterilizing the suit interface, recalibrating the pressure systems, and practicing deep breathing techniques like I was about to climb a mountain made of nerves and bioluminescent expectations. And finally, when everything was as safe as it was ever going to be, I stepped into the pod and saw her waiting, not nervous, not shy, just calm and glowing and infinitely patient, like she had already accepted whatever outcome came next and was just hoping I wouldn't fall over from stress, which was entirely possible, because my heart was pounding so loud I was surprised she couldn't see it through the suit. And she took a step forward, then another, until we were close enough that I could feel the subtle charge in the air between us, the kind of charge you get before a storm or a miracle. And she raised her hand, not to touch me yet, but to let me see it, steady and open and full of meaning. And then she did something I didn't expect. She placed her fingers gently against the outer shell of the suit's interface plate, and the light in her skin shifted into a slow ripple, blue and white and gold, a pattern I had seen once before, in the memories she shared of her people's bonding ceremony, not the permanent kind, but the temporary affirmation, the mutual offering of trust and emotion and memory. And I realized that this wasn't just a kiss for her, it was a declaration, a risk, a step into vulnerability that her entire culture treated with sacred caution. And I swallowed hard and lifted my gloved hand to mirror hers, letting our fingers align. And then I spoke, not because she could hear me, but because I needed to say it. I'm ready. And she understood, because her fingers began to glow brighter, and the suit interface chimed as it detected a synaptic alignment request, which was a fancy way of saying her body was trying to communicate with mine through nonverbal N. There are moments in your life when reality stops pretending to be linear and starts feeling like a spiral made entirely of memory and emotion, wrapped around a center point that pulses with meaning you were not previously equipped to process. And this was one of those moments. Because after what I could only describe as the alien equivalent of a kiss, my sense of self began to slip in the most bizarrely gentle way possible. I don't mean I lost my mind or forgot who I was, nothing quite that dramatic or clinical. Instead, it was like I had folded part of her emotional structure into mine, like tucking a note into the pocket of a coat and then walking away as if nothing had happened. At first, it was subtle, the way dreams began to change, the way I could see echoes of her light patterned thoughts even when she wasn't in the room. But then the echoes got stronger. Not invasive, not scary, just present, like a song stuck in your head. except the lyrics were entire experiences, and the melody was empathy. I didn't know how to tell her this without sounding unhinged, so instead, I showed her. The next time I stepped into the interface pod, I placed my hand on the inner surface of the helmet and closed my eyes. I thought about what I had seen the day before, a flash of her people dancing in concentric circles around glowing trees, their skin lit in coordinated rhythm, their thoughts synced into a shared pulse that felt like joy. She gasped, not out loud, but through the resonance between us, and I knew she felt it, because her hand shot out and pressed to the helmet. Her whole body shimmered in surprise and recognition, and she whispered something I couldn't hear, but that didn't matter, because I understood. She hadn't meant to give me that memory, and yet I had it anyway. And the weird thing was, I didn't mind. In fact, I wanted more. Not out of greed, but because the more I saw, the more I realized how little I knew, and how much I wanted to learn. She seemed to get that, because after a long moment of silence, she leaned forward and rested her forehead gently against the curved glass. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was in a suit. I felt like I was in her world, and I was welcome. I know that sounds poetic, and probably wildly impractical, but sometimes feelings don't care about practical. They just exist and demand to be acknowledged. In that space, between breath and signal, I let myself be present with her, and something shifted. Not in the room, not in the tech, but in us. We had been circling this for weeks, this sense of inevitability that we were no longer just two beings trying to coexist, but something closer to one being with two perspectives. The moment I thought that, I felt her blink. I don't know how to describe the sensation of someone blinking inside your own head, but trust me, it's distinct and not entirely unpleasant. When I opened my eyes, her face was still pressed to the glass, and her expression had softened into something that felt like relief. Then she began to draw again, not on the panel, but in the air. Her fingers trailed glowing shapes that hovered briefly before fading. I watched as she formed symbols I didn't recognize. She paused after each one, looking at me as if to ask, "Do you understand?" And weirdly, I did. Not perfectly, not intellectually, but emotionally, yes, I understood. She was telling me a story. The story of her first bonding, the first time she had connected to another of her kind fully and deeply, and how it had shattered when their ship went dark. She woke up alone and cold, and unable to speak to anyone, even herself. I felt that loss like it was my own, like her memories had poured into my emotional network and rewired the default settings of what sadness meant. I had to step back. I didn't, because I didn't want to frighten her, but I wanted to. I wanted to breathe real air and scream into the void, because nothing prepares you for the way someone else's heartbreak feels when it becomes part of your own timeline. She saw that. She saw it in my posture, in my... There's this moment after you fall in love with someone where everything seems like it should make more sense, but actually, it just gets more confusing in better lighting and sharper color. It's like when you finally clean the viewport of your ship and realize space is full of things that were always there, but you were too busy squinting through smudges to notice. That's how it felt being with Alen now, because even though we had crossed every imaginable line of emotional connection, and even some that probably hadn't been invented yet, I was still waking up every morning wondering if I was doing this right, or if doing it right even applied to interspecies relationships involving atmospherically incompatible, neural sharing, bioluminescent alien girls who thought my habit of talking to inanimate objects was charming instead of diagnosable. The weirdest part was how normal it was becoming, not in a bland way, but in the sense that it didn't scare me anymore to wake up thinking about her, to look forward to each interface session like it was the only thing tethering me to something real. Maybe it was, because my ship logs had gone from data entries to emotional journals with titles like "Today she showed me her homeworld's moon dance ceremony and I didn't cry, but I wanted to." The AI on board started asking if I wanted to reallocate memory resources to something other than resonance mapping, because it was now taking up 36% of internal bandwidth. I said no, because apparently my version of being a grown adult, professional explorer now included giving priority to the emotional waveform echoes of a woman I couldn't even hug without a helmet on. I was fine with that, which probably says more about me than I care to admit. If it sounds like I was adapting well, it's only because I hadn't yet faced the real problem, which is, what do you do when the person you love can't survive in your world, and you can't survive in theirs, and every beautiful moment is confined to a pod built from desperation and spare parts? Because love may conquer all, but it still needs a pressure seal and functional oxygen scrubbers. I found myself thinking about it more and more, especially after she started asking questions like what comes after again, or what does your kind do when feelings become anchored? That one nearly broke me, because feelings becoming anchored was the most poetic way I had ever heard someone describe falling in love, and also the most terrifying. The more I anchored, the more I realized I had no roadmap for this, and neither did she. We were just two people floating toward each other across a gulf filled with biology, history, physics, and no real plan. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay in the moment and let each day be enough, but another part, the cautious buried part that only speaks up when things start getting too good, kept whispering that at some point, someone was going to notice I was harboring an unregistered sentient xenolith form in violation of 17 different interstellar treaties. The kindest possible outcome was me getting court-martialed. The worst case involved dissection labs, and no amount of romantic idealism can make that thought go away. She knew I was stressed even before I admitted it, because she started writing different things on the panel, asking fewer questions about Earth customs and more about duration and endings. Then, one day, she wrote 3 words I hadn't seen from her before, and they translated as "Is this sustainable?" I stared at those words for so long I forgot to breathe, because that was the question, wasn't it? Not just are we allowed, but can we survive this? Not just emotionally, but literally. I wanted to lie. I wanted to write back yes. Always. Safe. Together. Forever. But the truth was, I didn't know. So I wrote, I wanted to be. She nodded once and didn't write anything else that day. It hurt more than I expected, because silence from her wasn't empty. It was full of the things she didn't want to say. The next morning, I didn't see. There comes a moment in every absurdly improbable love story when someone looks at all the risks and dangers and every reasonable argument against it, and then proceeds to do the exact opposite anyway, because feelings are rarely logical and love even less so, and in my case, that moment arrived precisely 36 hours after Alette told me she was dying, and I wish I could say that I handled it well, that I nodded with stoic understanding and came up with a brilliant plan involving quantum compressors and heartfelt speeches, but in reality, I dropped the data slate on my foot, yelled a profanity that echoed down the entire ship corridor, and sat there blinking at her like an idiot, while she simply waited, eyes glowing gently, not saying a word because she knew me too well by then to expect anything but chaos when my emotions got involved. And once I was done pacing and muttering and briefly threatening the air filtration system for its general uselessness, I finally looked at her again, really looked, and saw the lines of strain around her mouth, the dimming flickers beneath her skin where once there was steady resonance, and I knew, even before she tapped the readings into the console, that this was not a drill, not another temporary crisis for me to fix with tech and luck, but a terminal curve I couldn't flatten, and it crushed me, not with noise or panic, but with that quiet hopelessness you get when a system starts failing in slow motion, and all you can do is watch. And even as she smiled at me, that beautiful sad smile that said she had made peace with it long before she told me, I found myself whispering no, not because I thought it would change anything, but because saying it out loud felt like the only weapon I had left, and when I asked how long, she tilted her head and said not long enough to waste, which was not helpful but exactly the kind of poetic fatalism I had come to expect from a woman whose species spoke more through skin than words, and who measured love in proximity, not promises. So instead of trying to argue with inevitability, I did the only thing I could. I built her something, a space that wasn't quite safe but wasn't quite fatal either, a hybrid bubble chamber cobbled together from 3 life support modules, 2 emergency shields, 1 gravitic buffer coil, and more desperation than I care to admit. And when I activated it and saw the atmosphere readout stabilize at something that wouldn't kill either of us, immediately, I called her in, standing awkwardly in the middle of the chamber with a filtered mask strapped over my face and hands shaking from exhaustion, and when she stepped inside, barefoot, glowing faintly and dressed in the soft woven cloth she liked to wear when she was pretending to be calm, I almost cried, because she looked like starlight and silence and everything I would miss. And then she reached for me, and for the first time since we met, our bare skin touched. No suits, no gloves, no barriers, just heat and pulse and an overwhelming surge of resonance that made my vision blur and my knees go weak. And I don't know how to describe what it felt like to hold her in that moment, except to say it was like listening to a song you've known your whole life but never heard played out loud, and every beat was a memory, and every breath she took was a promise breaking and rebuilding at the same time. And when our foreheads met, and the bridge between us finally stabilized, without technology, without translation, just two beings trying to share a moment before one of them vanished, I felt her say thank you, not in words, but in pulses, in the slow blooming warmth that spread from her fingers to my spine. And then I kissed her, or rather, I let her kiss me the way her people did, through a pattern of touch and pressure and inhaled harmonics that made my lungs feel like fire and my brain like static. And yes, it hurt, and yes, it was dangerous, and no, I didn't care, because I had never been more alive than I was in that burning, breathless moment. And when we finally pulled apart, gas,